Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. I've been having a lot of conversations with people recently, both in person and online, about the best way to go about doing type dynamic development. So what type dynamics are is your relationship with your cognitive functions and their stack, or what we call the CAR model. And if you've been listening to us at all for any length of time, you know that our sound bite is develop the Copilot. That's what we say all the time. And what we mean by that is, in more technical terms, in your cognitive function stack, in your Myers-Briggs type, your auxiliary cognitive function. We feel like that's a leverage point. And the reason why we harp on that and say things like develop the Copilot is because we live in a soundbite world, and we know that people will take just one piece of information and they'll run with it. And we feel like that's the leverage point piece of information. If you're only going to do one thing, if you're going to discover your CAR model or your cognitive function stack, and you're only going to take one action, we feel like that's the most important action to take, because we feel like it's a domino you knock over. It's the beginning of a series of things that naturally start to emerge. But it's not the only thing that a person needs to do in order to well utilize an understanding of their personality type. There's actually a lot that is involved, and it can be a little complex. But it also, when you go on a growth path using this model as a tool in your arsenal, there does seem to be a sort of pattern that unfolds in development and type dynamics. So we don't feel like the only thing you have to do is develop your Copilot or your auxiliary cognitive function. We believe that's the starting point. And one of the things we wanted to talk about today was, for those of you who are interested, if you, the listener, is interested in going even deeper, then there is a certain, like I mentioned, a certain pattern that tends to evolve around type development. And so we wanted to address a little bit of that. So we're going to go, this is not going to be super complicated, but it might be a little bit more intermediate material. And we just want to warn you, if you're really brand spanking new to personality types or to cognitive functions.
If you haven't heard our podcast on the CAR model, that's probably a good place to start before we listen to this. Again, this can be more advanced, and that might give you a good framework. It will give you a good framework, in my opinion, for your personality type and how to see how the primary four cognitive functions you use, the mental processes of learning information and making decisions, it'll lay that out in a sequence or a stack, technically called stack, for you to see how your personality is wired. So I would recommend going back and listening to that podcast to get a good frame of reference as we talk today. And one of the things we struggle with here at Personality Hacker is keeping ourselves and the people, like clients and students of ours, on the right track as far as personal growth. Because remember, we're focused on personal growth here at Personality Hacker. We don't want to just talk about personality types for their own sake. We like personality types, but we see them as an access point for you to grow yourself and learn more about the people in your world, learn more about yourself. One of the challenges we have, though, is there's so much distraction, because these systems are they're fun to unpack and learn more about, right? If you start to learn more about cognitive functions, you start to explore, wow, what else can I learn about this? And then you get into exploring maybe shadow functions and all these different type dynamics and all this extra stuff about yourself. And one of the things we caution you about is that can be a path of distraction for you, because it can take the eye off of personal growth. It can put it onto just learning more about the system under the noble guise of learning more about yourself, thinking, well, that's, if I know more about myself, that's growing myself, right? Well, to some degree, awareness can be helpful, but also true behavior change is real learning, right? When you actually learn and you change behavior and you grow yourself through behavior change, through the changes you make in your life, that's how we've defined personal growth. That's where we see growth happening. So sometimes I've seen people get a hold of the Myers-Briggs system, as an example, or the Enneagram, and they just make things very nuanced. They keep slicing and dicing the system down to its core components, and they get in touch with every possible facet of, shadow functions and Enneagram wings and all these different elements. And it's like, wait, back up for a second. The whole point of doing this is for behavior change and growth, right? So let's be very careful as we talk about this today. You don't use this as an avenue to sideline your growth path. And this is also why we keep harping on that soundbite of growing the Copilot. It's a great place to start. And if we died tomorrow and that message got out into the world, we believe that's a really good leveraged message, soundbite message for you to hear, because it's a good place to start. And then there's more to do after that, but that's usually where most people have to start in their lives. So I just want to make that quick caveat that growth is the goal here. We love the system. We love to look more at nuances of the system, but don't forget the point of why we're talking about this in the first place.
Yeah. So we talk about it getting obsessed with diagnostics and forgetting the prescription. And so we just want to make sure that we're very clear that that diagnostics is fascinating and prescription is important. So with all that caveat in mind, right, all that bookended statement in mind, let's talk a little bit about the pattern that usually evolves when a person starts going down their personal development path or journey using an understanding of their cognitive functions. So, of course, cognitive functions you have, and we'll use both the technical terms and the car model terms just to make it easy. You've got the driver or the dominant function. You've got the co-pilot or auxiliary. You've got the 10-year-old or tertiary function, and you've got the 3-year-old or inferior. And then if you look at models like John Beebe's 8-function model, then you also have the shadow functions, which are the functions between 5 and 8. The 5th function is what Beebe calls the opposing personality. It is the same function as your dominant or driver, but in the opposite attitude. So effectively, take Joel and I, we both are ENPs. We lead with extroverted intuition, or what we call exploration. And then that means that our 5th function, that opposing personality, is also intuition, but it's in the opposite attitude. So our 5th function would be introverted intuition, or what we call perspectives. And then you take that same pattern and go all the way down to the 8th function. So the 6th function, which he calls the witch or senex, is the same function as your co-pilot or auxiliary, but in the opposite attitude. So I'm an ENTP. My auxiliary or co-pilot is introverted thinking or accuracy, and that would make my 6th function extroverted thinking or effectiveness.
So for an INFJ, for example, they would lead with introverted intuition as their dominant or primary driver function. Their 5th function would be extroverted intuition or exploration, and that co-pilot is extroverted feeling. That 6th function would be introverted feeling or authenticity.
Right. And that pattern falls all the way down again. So the 7th function for me is an ENTP. My 3rd function is extroverted feeling or harmony. So my 7th function would be introverted feeling or authenticity. And this is what BB calls the trickster. And then the final function, the 8th function, is again the opposite attitude of your 4th. So my 4th function as an ENTP is introverted sensing or memory. And that would make my 8th function extroverted sensing or sensation.
Now remember, if you're overwhelmed by what we're talking about, if you're a new listener, take a breath. You don't have to know this out of the gate. This is some advanced stuff, okay? Just so you know that. Yeah. Just you can relax. It's not something you're like, oh my gosh, this is so complicated and intense.
Joel is always worried about losing new listeners.
I want it to be accessible.
I do too.
Because it's so easy for us to get into kind of this cult-like you have to have the inside speak to be able to, access this material. I don't want that to become the case at all.
I know, I'm with you. But it is a little advanced, but it's okay. It's okay. People are with us. It's going to be cool. All right. So you've got now 8 functions, and you have probably never really heard us here at Personality talk about the shadow functions, the 5th through 8. Even though I actually really like BB's work, I always make a caveat that my observation has been that our relationship with our shadow functions is also very much influenced by the people in our lives, and basically our relationship to those functions that are less predictable than a clean sliced model can really evidence. But I think that's kind of the case with our first 4 functions too. And I'm pretty sure that John Beebe would agree with me. I'm pretty sure that Beebe would agree that it's not such a clean model, but it is an interesting model to look at in terms of type dynamics and growth. And there's a couple of things that Beebe says that I think are dead on accurate, which is that the cognitive functions that we favor in our 4-function stack or in our car model, we believe that we are using those functions right based on the attitude in which we prefer them. Meaning that as somebody who uses extroverted intuition, anybody who's using introverted intuition to me is using intuition on some level, they're using it wrong. Now, that doesn't mean I can't appreciate introverted intuition or perspectives or really enjoy having conversations with people who favor this. I love conversations with NJs, and I have learned a lot from the introverted intuition function. That said, there are ways in which people who favor the introverted version of intuition are using it wrong, in my opinion, and I totally resonate with that. So BB used an example one time of somebody who uses introverted intuition, an NJ, withholding information from someone who uses extroverted intuition or an NP. And the NP looks at the NJ and goes, "Why didn't you tell me that piece of information? Why didn't you share that?" It felt to the person who uses the extroverted version of it, it felt like withholding. And to the person who uses introverted intuition, it wasn't a well-baked thought. It wasn't complete, because to people who use introverted intuition or perspectives, that journey is happening internally. And so they don't really share, or often don't share, that process until they feel like they have at least some sense of completion around it, because they're not using it in a let's figure out this pattern together in real time outside of myself. They're not using it in that fashion. And then, of course, the opposite would also be true. Somebody who's using introverted intuition or perspectives is going to look at somebody using extroverted intuition or exploration as using it in some ways wrong. Like, why would you present half-baked thoughts? Why wouldn't you take more time and effort to think about it and fillet it out a little bit more before you start presenting it to the world and just, throwing spaghetti around willy-nilly? You're never going to get a depth of insight that you could be getting with your intuition if you don't give yourself time to fully flesh it out. And there's a version of this on down the line. And you can see this maybe most clearly in online fights around particularly extroverted feeling and introverted feeling, that harmony authenticity thing. In fact, when we were going through our INFX Empowered program, we were noticing that there is a lot of maybe hard feelings, I'd almost say, that people have with one of these two functions. And it's usually people who are using the opposite attitude of that same function. Like FJs and FPs can have some real serious beef with each other. And I find it really fascinating that there's this sense to people who are using these functions that the opposite attitude is the wrong way of going about this. It's not that it's a bad function, it's that you're handling it wrong. Okay, so that means that for all of us, our shadow functions are a place where we feel that those functions are being done wrong. So it takes on a sense of criticism, right? It's like a critical place, both in our opinion and how we tend to use them. We tend to have a complex relationship with those functions. It's not as cut and dry as our 4-function stack or our car model, where we feel at least some level of simpatico with each of these functions. Because those functions are being done right, it's just we might not be great at doing them. Like, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about our tertiary or 10-year-old function or inferior 3-year-old. Like, we might not be expert at handling them, but they are really important to us. And we go there on a regular basis. And on some unconscious level, when we use those functions, we're using them the right way. We just might not be handling them as well as somebody who maybe has them, as more of a strength in their stack.
And I think we also appreciate people that have them. So, like, I appreciate ISTJs in some ways because they have all the same functions, just in a different order. There's almost a simpatico I have with. And I think you have a appreciation for ISFJs, as an example. It's almost like there's this sense of like, I get what you're doing. I appreciate the fact that you are able to exercise something in my personality that's weakness. You use it as a strength, and I like that.
Yeah, there's a sense of admiration. And that's in part because they're manifesting things that are part of our aspiration. Like, we've talked a bit before in the podcast about how that 4th function, which we call the inferior, and John Beebe's model calls the anima or the animus, that's part of our aspiration for us to do better. Because it's a struggle, it's a perpetual struggle in our life. We have to find creative ways to solve challenges that would normally be solved by using that function that we just don't have very sophisticated access to. And it ends up being something that we want to do better at. And we find ourselves, when we go there and balance ourselves out in that way, we find ourselves performing much better, which we'll talk about in just a bit when we discuss that pattern that we have observed that people usually go through when they're developing their function stack. But that said, there's just this sense that it's a matter of handling it better, not a matter of making peace with that tertiary and inferior or 10-year-old and 3-year-old. Whereas our relationship to our shadow functions is more complex because it's not just a matter of like handling it, it's also a matter of making peace with them and not seeing them as being done not poorly, being done wrong. Like that's the wrong way to go about that. So we're not going to dive too deeply into the patterns of how people develop their 5th through 8th function. John Beebe's model is very interesting, and we'll probably end up doing like an entire podcast on it in the future because I know that people are getting more sophisticated in the type community and they're ready for that kind of content. But that said, we have a tendency to shy away from really diving deep into the 5th through 8th functions because, as Joel mentions, we can get really into diagnostic. Our fear is that, or not our fear, but the reason why we don't stick with just perpetually filleting out these models over and over and over again is the challenge, as Joel mentioned before, is that we can get really obsessed with this fine-grained diagnostic, sort of relationship with type. And for us at PH, our goal is to, if we learn something, we're implementing something. If we learn about it and we use it, if we find it fascinating, our fascination usually ends where the application of it helping us become better, where that ends. And I strongly believe that you can use your 5th through 8th functions as growth tools for sure. However, it can be a little distracting, especially if you haven't really gotten a strong handle on the 1st through 4th functions. I also think that people use the 5th through 8th functions oftentimes to try to type themselves and each other. And the challenge with that is unless you have an extraordinary grasp on the distinctions between these functions, and in particular, how the polarities of the functions can look like another function entirely, unless you have a really, really solid grasp on all of that, using those 5th through 8th functions to type yourself and to type other people it's like jumping into really complex, sophisticated math when really you just got to wrap your head around algebra first. So we don't recommend people use it as much for typing themselves because, unless you really, really, really get the distinct difference between how the polarity of introverted thinking and extroverted feeling can show up to other people and to yourself as extroverted thinking, because that happens, it's best to just kind of not touch that and really focus on your dominant, your auxiliary, or your driver, Copilot, your 10-year-old and your 3-year-old. So all of that said, let's talk a little bit about that pattern of how type development works. And the reason why, by the way, I even mentioned John Beebe is because there is one element in the shadow functions that seems to kind of come in here as people are developing the 1st through 4 functions. So I wanted to make sure people had at least some familiarity with that concept so that we can address this phenomenon that tends to sneak in when people are developing functions 1 through 4. Okay, so we start with the beginning. We start with the first function, the dominant. And there is I think sometimes there's a misnomer that because it's our dominant, it's always well developed. And I think that maybe even sometimes because we have been so insistent on focusing on development of the Copilot or auxiliary function, I think sometimes we even give this sense that your dominant or driver's fine, don't worry about it, just focus on the auxiliary.
I think of it like somebody working on a farm who lifts bales of hay and has to haul heavy equipment all the time. Their muscles build up, but probably in a particular part of their body. But a bodybuilder or somebody that goes to the gym is disciplining and focusing on all the muscles in their body, right? So it's more rounded out. So you might be really strong and muscular, but maybe just in your arms and shoulders and your legs aren't as worked out. That's kind of how I think of the dominant driver process in that metaphor.
Meaning there's aspects of your dominant or driver that are probably well exercised.
Exactly.
Right, but there might be other aspects of it because every cognitive function does multiple things.
Correct.
Right, it's not just doing one thing, it's doing a lot of things. And sometimes we find almost like one-trick ponies with our dominant.
Yeah, exactly. It's the difference between using something and exercising or disciplining yourself towards something. So I see that as it just happens because you're using it a lot. You're going to get strong in certain areas, and if you focus on it, once you have awareness of it and you focus on it, now you're able to grow and round out that process fully.
Yeah, and I've noticed that when you're developing your auxiliary or Copilot, if you have development in your driver or dominant that still needs attention, that will be borne out because you're just on a growth path in general. It's almost like once you start developing your auxiliary or Copilot function, it treats your dominant in a way where it has to lean on it more. It has to. It's like it puts more pressure through the pipes, and when you put more pressure through the pipes, it exposes the cracks. So if you are doing development work in your auxiliary or Copilot, it starts to expose the cracks of your dominant driver, and then it sort of forces you to go, patch those cracks.
There's a limit to how much you can grow any part of your personality or functions, because it's kind of like, and we're using a lot of metaphors here, so I'll throw in one more. I like to look at it as like a three-legged race where you can only move so far, and then you're tethered to like a leg that has to also be brought up to continue going. So you can only go so far until you bring the other leg up with the person you're tied to on a three-legged race. It's kind of like that for your functions. You can go so far, and all of a sudden it's like, well, I can't grow my Copilot till I get my dominant and driver under control again. So let's move that now. So it's like this, you're kind of moving all of these at the same time. And that's kind of why we're recording this podcast, right? Is because this is how we see it at this point. You can't just grow your Copilot in isolation forever. It's going to challenge you in other ways and other parts of your personality to grow those too.
And we don't experience functions in isolation. We talk about functions in isolation and we study them in isolation in order to get a grasp on them, but they don't exist in isolation. They always have a relationship to the other functions you're using, sometimes to a point where it's difficult to see where one stops and the other one begins. And it's flavored by the other functions in our stack or in our car model, which is why two people who have the same dominant or driver function, like you and I, Joel, as two ENPs, look very different in practice because our auxiliary functions are so different. I'm using introverted thinking or accuracy, and you're using introverted feeling or authenticity. And that changes our dynamic, our type dynamic, and how we show up so much. And it colors our extroverted intuition. Like the things I'm interested in with my extroverted intuition or exploration is different than yours. And sometimes we have some crossover, and we've had a lot of joy and pleasure in sharing our interests and the direction our function, our dominant function has gone. But they definitely went very different directions. You grew up doing photography and art and, like sort of studying Ansel Adams and doing film and wanting to be a filmmaker. And I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons and watching Monty Python and, playing video games and totally geeking out. And of course, there's going to be ENFPs out there that resonate more with what I was doing and ENTPs that resonate more with what Joel is doing. But I actually think that those are pretty good, accurate gauges of how extroverted intuition or exploration showed up very different from us. The patterns that we were looking at for me, even when I was in a fantasy realm, I was still working with stats, right? D&D is all about stats and min-maxing and that sort of thing. Whereas your exploration was all about art and expression, which is very, that's predictive for somebody using introverted feeling or authenticity as a supplement. That said, I've noticed that you and I, when we embarked on our very intense development of our auxiliary functions of introverted thinking for me and introverted feeling for you, I noticed that the muscle of our extroverted intuition or exploration got stronger for both of us. We got a better grasp on how it should be used and ways in which we might have been misusing it. And we were able to clean up some of the spillage of how, because extroverted intuition in particular, and this might be something that's a more apt illustration for people who are NPs, but that function in particular is not very economic, right? It's a resource hog, and it has a tendency to burn through a lot. And that's part of what you just sort of accept. When you're an NP, you accept that that's part of your life, that you burn more resource than than other people of other types are going to in order to accomplish the same thing. And at the same time, we noticed that our burns, the things that we were applying all of our time and energy to, became more economic over time because we started to observe how much we were wasting, how much effort we were wasting on things that didn't truly mean something to us. And once we got that auxiliary function down, our Copilot down, we got really targeted on the things that mean something to us. And so we became a lot more efficient in using our dominant. And I'm sure that there's a version of this pattern in every type.
I've seen this with Cheris on our team, who basically leads all the back end of Personality Hacker, right? She just completely handles all the logistics and administration and customer service stuff. She's an INFJ in the Myers-Briggs system, and I've seen her in the past few years growing her extroverted feeling Copilot. And she's always been insightful. She's always had good insights, but they are getting super calibrated now. Like her driver process of introverted intuition, she's getting deeper and more accurate and more fulfilling and more useful insights because of her growing her Copilot. I've literally watched it happen. So this isn't just for ENPs. Like I've seen an INFJ go through this exact same experience. It's been really interesting to watch her getting better at her driver dominant by growing her Copilot.
Yeah, she's less self-protective.
Yeah,
and I think I've noticed that with INJs when they really develop that auxiliary function, that Copilot, is they become less self-protective. And so their insights become better because they're not as fear-based. They don't have their own personal, fear of vulnerability bias woven into it. And so they generally have better insights and predictive abilities because it's not being colored by their own personal challenges. And there is a version of this for every type. So development of that auxiliary function is really crucial, not just to develop that if you already have a well-developed driver or dominant, but it actually helps hone that, right? It makes it better. It rounds out your driver or dominant. And if you have a lot of work to do in your driver and you go into your auxiliary and start to try to develop that, just by nature, if you really are on a serious personal development path, it will kick you back into that driver and you'll go, oh, maybe I need to do more work there. And you will. And it's good because doing work in your driver is actually quite fun and it's usually very rewarding. It's not as difficult. You just have to be willing to use that muscle a little differently than what you're used to. So our observation has been that, and by the way, when we say our observation, we're talking about ourselves, the people who've worked with us, our coaching clients, our students. This is a pattern that we've seen over and over and over again. And our observation has been that once you start to get that auxiliary or Copilot function more and more dialed in, because the difficulty in the beginning is to just really understand what it means to begin with. Right? What is that auxiliary function? What does it actually do? What's all the different ways in which it shows up? How have I been neglecting it and how I've been maybe overusing it in single capacity? How do I get out of my comfort zone on a regular basis? Because remember, it's forcing you into the attitude that's different than your driver, meaning that if you're an introvert, your Copilot or auxiliary is forcing you into an extroverted space. And if you're an extrovert, that Copilot or auxiliary is forcing you into an introverted space. So it's forcing you to contend with and make peace with all sorts of uncomfortable things and cans you've probably been kicking down the road. And then once you do that, it seems like it's not just a 1, 2, 3, 4 scenario where you automatically go to the third function. It seems actually that you enter a dance. You enter a space where now your auxiliary or Copilot and your 10-year-old or tertiary function start to get into this sense of better choreography, because that 10-year-old or tertiary, for most people, is a place that was over-relied upon before they started doing Copilot or auxiliary work. And now, once you sort of back off of the need to be so insistent in that auxiliary because you've done some decent work there, now your 10-year-old or tertiary shows up and goes, okay, it's time for me to take over again. But you have a much stronger, quote unquote, parental figure sitting there. And so instead of just handing power over to the 10-year-old or tertiary, which is what might have happened in the past, now you've got this dynamic between an adult that's trying to get a kid under control again when maybe the kid was far more controlling in the past. So now parenting starts happening, parenting over that 10-year-old or tertiary. And then those two functions, which remember are polarity opposites, by the way, neither exists without the other. So they already have a sense of simpatico. Now they get into this question or this conversation about when is one the appropriate tool for a situation, and when is the other one the appropriate tool for a situation.
When I think about this, I think about the show from like 10 or 15 years ago. It might still be on, but I don't have TV anymore. So I don't remember Super Nanny. And I also think about the Dog Whisperer when I think about this whole dynamic. In both of those shows, they're trying to help address either children, in the case of Super Nanny, who are out of control, and need discipline, or a dog who's out of control and needs discipline. And both of the people that come in to help end up working with the parents to create the structure for the child or the dog. It's not actually about working with the kids directly. It's about training the parent to actually be, or a dog owner to actually be a parent or dog owner. And once they train the parent or dog owner to be a parent or dog owner, the children and dogs get in line. Not that I'm comparing children to dogs, just make sure I make that comment. I'm just noticing both these shows. This is kind of the dynamic that plays out. And once they calibrate the owner or the parent, now it's a much better dynamic. But that's where all the work is done, under the guise of trying to fix the kid or fix the animal, which isn't actually what's happening, because it's the other entity that needs to be corrected. That's kind of how I see it here. It's a lot of times we look, oh man, my 10-year-old tertiary process is defensive and needs work, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, well, the best thing you can do for that is focus on that parent of the Copilot auxiliary function. And just by the nature of doing that, now that 10-year-old or tertiary has a place to rest into. It has almost like, it is a childlike part of us. It has a parent now to lean on and support rather than driving the show, right? And I think this is kind of a metaphor, a way we can look at this, is that's why we attend again to the Copilot, is that 10-year-old now comes under its authority, under its leadership, and it's able to rest into that as a supplemental part of us.
Yeah, John Beebe calls it the pure or the puella or puella, which means eternal child. And so there's like an eternal child aspect of our 10-year-old or tertiary. And I remember, I think I'm accurate, I might not be because I haven't watched it in a long time either, but I think Cesar Millan's tagline was, I train owners, I rehabilitate dogs. And so there's a rehabilitation that has to happen with that 10-year-old or tertiary function if it was in control of the car before, or in control of the dynamic before, which is actually pretty easy to have happen. And once you have trained the Copilot or auxiliary to be a good parent, then simply the 10-year-old or tertiary just needs to be rehabilitated at that time to not show up when it's the inappropriate, an inappropriate tool for the job. But of course, it never completely works all on its own. And it is a polarity with the Copilot or auxiliary, meaning that there's no such thing in like my type as an ENTP. There's no such thing as introverted thinking or accuracy without extroverted feeling or harmony, and vice versa. They exist on a continuum. And so there are many ways in which my 10-year-old or tertiary shows up in a beautiful way, in a way where if I didn't have that function showing up the way that it's showing up, I would probably be hosed, right? I would be way too clinical. I'd be a much, much harsher person. I'm already kind of harsh a little bit. You'll see this mostly if you engage with me in any form of writing. When I'm writing on social media or through email, I come across like way harsher than
I think you're direct, not harsh.
I'm direct, and a lot of people
They interpret that as harsh.
And if I didn't have that extroverted feeling or harmony piece underpinning it, I think I would be, I'd be an evil scientist, which all TPs would be without that part of who we are. But I've noticed that, particularly as I've been developing introverted thinking or accuracy more and more and more, I've noticed that the way that my 10-year-old or tertiary shows up for me is that instead of handing my power over to other people, which is what I used to do when I overplayed my hand in that function, like when I was over-reliant on my 10-year-old or tertiary, in order to maintain relationships, I would just hand my power over to other people, and I would let them dictate how I was going to live, basically. And when I really grasped the importance of living my personal truth and being radically honest with myself and others, living my personal truth is like too much of a Facebook meme way of saying it. I actually prefer the concept of radical honesty with self and others. And when I rooted out, when I got to a place where I really fell in love with the process of seeking and rooting out cognitive dissonance, which I don't think can ever truly be done like in completion, but I really fell in love with the process of it. Once that happened, I noticed that my 10-year-old tertiary of extroverted feeling or harmony started showing up by wanting to bring positive things to others, by wanting to be in service to them, not handing my power over to them, but allowing my power to be useful to others, keeping my power in myself and also being able to be of service, right? Almost like a servant mentality, which I have no problem with. I don't think having a servant mentality is necessarily giving your power away because you're the person who chose to serve. And so it's like you're turning yourself into a servant to be in alignment with your values. Anyway, that's probably a whole can of worms all by itself, my opinion on that. But I noticed that what happens then is when I realize that people are in need of something, maybe something I promised or something that they've been looking forward to, that's a part of our ecosystem. As soon as I get a ping where the person's like, hey, where'd that thing go? Or what are you guys doing about that? Or are you going to upload that Q&A that I wasn't able to be there for? Immediately my extroverted feeling or harmony function pops up and goes, hey, we need to get that out to them. We need to make that happen. So it's a big piece of my motivation. And I'm very grateful that I have it as a motivation, as a part of me that wants to be of service to other people. And I'm super glad that it's also not dicking me around and making me hand my power over to others and make me feel super disempowered because the relationships in my past life, my relationships ended up taking over for my own, what makes sense to me. So this dance that happens between my Copilot and my 10-year-old, this rehabilitation choreography that happens, I believe has turned me into a much sharper thinker. Because in those moments when my 10-year-old or tertiary shows up and goes, hey, we need to serve other people, as opposed to going, oh God, I have to immediately get into action and go do whatever it just told me to do, my introverted thinking or accuracy goes, hang tight. Why am I doing this? What is the purpose of this? Right? Am I doing this to be in integrity with myself or to get people to like me? And because I always have it go through that filter, then when I show up and when I'm doing things for other people, it's always more honest. It's honest work. It's in integrity. It's higher quality because I want to serve others. I don't want them to just like me. And so everything has increased in value in what I produce, in my opinion, because I'm at this place where I'm really managing this dance between those two functions. And I think there's a version of this that shows up for every type.
I think it's a selective thing. So when that 10-year-old tertiary process is in alignment, under the authority or under the guidance or leadership of the Copilot, I think it's understanding when and when not to turn it on or to allow it to be expressed. So there are still communities, for example, like we just came out of our profiler training community, where you have still handed over your extroverted feeling to that community to a sense. They don't completely control you, but they have enough influence that you're not completely autonomous in that community. But you're selective with when you hand that over. You don't just do it willy-nilly. It's not like a childlike, well, everybody gets this. You are selective, and it makes sense to you when you do that. And I think for my 10-year-old tertiary, the same thing. I think you listening, if you check in with your 10-year-old tertiary process and you have a good relationship with it and it's in service to your Copilot, I think you're going to see it being selectively used when it's appropriate. It's not either on or off. It's a very selective process. It's a very thoughtful, selective process for when you bring it up.
Yeah, and even the example you just used shows that there's always more work to do.
Sure.
Because you're talking about being at our profiler training live event in LA that we just got back from a couple weeks ago. And in my desire to connect with students and to have fun and be in that connective space, I stayed up way too late multiple nights. And my introverted thinking or accuracy is like, what the hell are you doing? Go back to the hotel room. You have to go to bed. You have to teach 8 or 9 hours tomorrow. Why are you staying up till 11 o'clock or midnight? And
no, it was like 2 a.m. a couple nights, wasn't it?
Not for me. I didn't stay up till 2. No. Because I would have in yesteryear.
Well, on East Coast time.
Yeah, on East Coast time. Exactly. Because I do generally live East Coast time. You're right. Yes, you are accurate if we're talking about East Coast time. But if we're talking about Pacific time, which is where I was at the time, I didn't go past midnight. But that was still way past what I should have. And I should have probably had more alone time. And so I'm still figuring this out. There's still a part of me that gets giddy and wants to go play and be like a 10-year-old. And there are moments when my parental introverted thinking or accuracy doesn't quite have the reins. And yet for the most part it does. And I was able to get through the whole 5 or 6 days. So I didn't overdo it, but I definitely pushed the limit. And I think that that's part of it. I think that dynamic between the auxiliary Copilot and the tertiary 10-year-old, I think that's a lifelong dance. Like, I don't think you ever fully master that, but I think you get better and better and better. Okay, so what happens after that? So if you noticed, I didn't say we go from the second function to the third. We go from the second function to a rehabilitative relationship with our third. And then a funny thing happens, which is that it's almost as if our inferior 3-year-old is peeking over the shoulder of what's going on with the Copilot auxiliary and the 10-year-old tertiary. Like, it notices that there's a relationship, a sympatical relationship that is being forged over there. And it's almost like it goes, me too, I want to do that. And suddenly, while you're still in the midst of that dynamic sort of shift between your second and third function, all of a sudden your fourth function's like, I totes want to do that with my first function. And so it starts getting really insistent. It starts basically indicating to you that if you don't get your shit together in that fourth function, all that work that's being done in the second and third is for nothing. And so we naturally start turning our attention to the fourth, or the inferior 3-year-old function that we call it in the CAR model. But it's not about development. It's not about getting better at it. That's not the focal point. It's about integrating it as an aspiration. It actually might be inappropriate to state that it wants attention and it suddenly jerks our attention to it. I think it's more that our life evidences to us, or sort of it emerges, this necessity to have a good ballast in our inferior function. It's less that it's like, me too. It's more that we get this feeling that something's missing. And that thing that's missing also needs to be part of this choreography.
Part of why, at least in my life, and some of the people I've seen, their lives, have avoided growing their Copilot or auxiliary is because it's in the same attitude as that 3-year-old or inferior. And we know that once we go, like, I'm an extrovert, and once I go to grow my introverted feeling Copilot auxiliary, I'm going to open up my introverted world. And now the things I have been avoiding looking at in my introverted sensing process at the 3-year-old or inferior level is going to pop up for me. So I think all of us have this. If you're an introvert and you go into that extroverted Copilot, start to grow that, the extroverted 3-year-old process is going to show up as well. And that's part of why we avoid going to our Copilot. It's because we know, you've used the phrase before, Antonia, there be dragons. There's a lot of stuff maybe down there that we don't want to see about ourselves or are challenging for us or whatever. So I think you're right. I don't think there's as much intent. It's almost like it comes along for the ride with the introverted parent in our car. And we're so focused on trying to balance that Copilot 10-year-old, that auxiliary and tertiary. They're like, oh yeah, I got this other kid over here that came in the car too. And anybody that's a parent has this experience. You're like so focused on disciplining your kid or like focused on getting their need met. You're like, oh yeah, I've got another child over here that I've been neglecting for the last hour. I'm sorry. And you turn your attention over there too, but they came along for the ride. I think that's part of what's happening there. It is probably less intent from that part of us. It's more just, it's there. And now it's there and we've got to do something about it often.
Yeah. And having an auxiliary function be in the same attitude, extroverted or introverted attitude as the 3-year-old or inferior, it's almost like a parent that has more simpatico with that child, right? Because they kind of understand each other in that way. And so that function is going to naturally be less almost threatened by the inferior function. And so, like you mentioned, there's going to be more opportunities for it to manifest and for it to gain some exposure. I do think that there's a part of that inferior function that's threatening to all of us, particularly since we're programmed to defend our right to use our dominant function. And it feels like, because of course that's also a polarity. The dominant driver and the inferior 3-year-old are a polarity as well. They're intrinsically linked. One does not exist without the other. And there's almost a sense that the inferior function, or that 3-year-old function, threatens the freedom of the driver dominant to express. But once you get this idea, or not even idea, but once you start to observe how the auxiliary Copilot and the 10-year-old tertiary can create a really beautiful dynamic between each other, where they help inform each other and they season each other's efficacy. When the dominant or driver function and I'm using these, I'm personalizing or personifying these functions as if they have intent, which of course, like they're not people, they're just parts of people. So let's pretend this fantasy that they have like will and intent and agenda and
They're characters.
They're characters. This is just for learning purposes only. Don't overvalue how I'm talking about this, please. But let's pretend they were to be characters. It's almost as if the observation of the dance between the auxiliary Copilot and the 10-year-old Tertiary informs the dominant or driver that by integrating that inferior 3-year-old is not going to make it worse. It's not going to make it lose freedom in its ability to express, but it's actually going to empower it to do a better job. It's going to help create circumstances and context in which it becomes a better version of itself when it's got that part of it integrated, because it's there anyway. And if you're not paying attention to that part of who you are, it's going to show up. We talk about being in the grip. We talk about moments when it throws temper tantrums, but it's also going to be still whispering in your ear. And if you don't give it anything to go on, if you don't give it any attention, if you don't nourish it in any way, then it's still whispering in your ear. It's just giving you really terrible advice. And so you get these feelings that something should be done or you should be doing something. And so you try to implement on that feeling, and then you just do it in a really sort of clumsy, bastardized way. Or you could pay it attention and you can observe it and you can have it be a more conscious part of the process. And in that way, when it's whispering in your ear, you understand the messages that it's giving you. You understand sort of the purpose of its existence. And it helps, again, season and inform the efficacy, again, I'll use that word, of the dominant or driver. So take, for example, let's say you're an EFJ, an ESFJ, or an ENFJ, and your inferior function is introverted thinking or accuracy. There's this feeling that all EFJs have that truth should be known, right? Like there's something that's really important about information exchange. And
truth should be taught is how they actually see it, I think, a lot of times.
A lot of times, exactly. And so there's a teacher part of who they are. There's a part of them that wants to talk about what's true and real. The challenge is that if an EFJ doesn't have a fully integrated, or at least partly integrated, is on the path of integrating that function of introverted thinking or accuracy, what ends up happening is oversharing, is maybe revealing truths that aren't theirs to reveal, maybe talking about a piece of information that somebody else gave them that is not their right to share with somebody else. But there's this sense that it's important to share truths without observing the compulsion, by observing the compulsion or acting on the compulsion without observing the seasoning that an integrated introverted thinking or accuracy process will have, then it ends up destroying relationships, because you're talking about things that maybe somebody told you in private that you gave to a third party, and now that person is pissed as hell at you for doing that, and now your ability to maintain the relationship and have a good back and forth connection with your extroverted feeling with this person is now compromised. But if you've got an integrated introverted thinking or accuracy part of you, then it is more about teaching people good information and sharing with people things that you believe are important, that everybody should be thinking, because this is a calibrated thought that is, that if all of us were on board with this kind of belief structure or this thinking, then we would be doing a better job. If you have it integrated, then you won't just assume that it's automatically sharing the first thought that came into your head, but it's actually vetting your own thoughts and being willing to be wrong and being willing to reevaluate your positions. And so when you share these beliefs, it's not just everybody should believe as I do, but this is a well-vetted thought. And this is something that other people have a right to hear, regardless of whether or not they accept it. So it turns less into this sort of sloppy, everybody gets to know everything that's in my head, and it turns more into an attunement to positive ideas that help us all to stay in connection with each other. And again, there's a version of this for every cognitive function, polarity.
Yeah.
I'm using a lot of extroverted feeling, introverted thinking stuff today. So my apologies to everybody who uses all the other function polarities. And I'm also doing an outrageous amount of talking on this particular podcast. I hope I'm not sucking the oxygen out of the room.
Well, I mean, podcasts take different forms. This one, you have a vision for how you want to get some of this content laid out. So I think it's good.
Okay.
Keep going.
So sometimes I'm on this introverted thinking track, right? I'm almost channeling from like something else, somewhere else. And poor Joel just sits there and looks at me and blinks, and he's like,
"Oh, I smile sometimes."
He's like, okay, just keep going. You just do your thing, man. All right. So the final element of my observation, or our observation of how people's, type dynamics usually shows up, and this is why we even mentioned John Beebe in the beginning, is that after there's this sort of, or not after, during this complicated dance that's now happening with your first four functions, a better developed dominant, a well-developed auxiliary, a rehabilitated tertiary, and an integrated inferior, which, by the way, helps the dominant, again, be even better. Now that there's this sort of dance that's happening with all four members, there's another function that has a tendency to pop up and rear its head and goes, hey, I'm going to need some attention too. And that is the sixth function. The sixth function that Beebe calls the senex, or the witch. Now, again, every function in your shadow that uses your functions in an opposite attitude, right? Meaning that your sixth function it's the same function as your auxiliary or Copilot, but it's in the opposite attitude. So for me, that would be extroverted thinking or effectiveness. For you, Joel, that would be extroverted feeling or harmony. All of a sudden, it seems to show up and go, hey, I'm going to need some attention too, right? I'm also going to need to be integrated in all of this. And I don't have a really solid, I see this pattern. I don't have a solid theory for why. I've just seen this happen over and over, and I instinctively know this is true. In fact, I was talking to Dario Nardi not that long ago, and he was saying that his observation has been the same thing, is that as you get your type dynamics sort of more and more locked in with your first four functions, all of a sudden that sixth function comes in, and it needs some attention, time, and integration as well.
My suspicion of why that sixth function might be important, I'll take myself as an example really quick. ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system, introverted feeling authenticity is my Copilot auxiliary. My sixth function would be extroverted feeling harmony. And it rounds out my feeling function, so I both have the introverted feeling part of it, and now I have the extroverted feeling part of it. We saw this at our live event recently where I was doing some things from the stage with the crowd, with crowd control. I got a little bit of feedback, a calibrated feedback from someone, and I was able to almost tap into my extroverted feeling harmony, sixth function in a way, to help get the needs of the student body that was in the room, 75 people. I was able to attend to the needs better in a more, elegant way than I might have 20 years ago or 15 years ago. Like I'm starting to see that come up more, almost an extroverted feeling part of myself. So for an INFJ, extroverted feeling would be their Copilot auxiliary. So that would mean their sixth function would be their introverted feeling authenticity process. And you can almost see them getting in touch with maybe as they mature with their personal truths and what they stand for, their core values, things like this. INTJ, extroverted thinking. Now it's introverted thinking at that sixth function. So it's rounding out that thinking process with the opposite attitude. It's a more rounded out Copilot almost. If you add out the other attitude, I think that's probably why this becomes something that's really interesting for us to look at, because we're so focused on Copilot growth already, right? That function that's there in its current attitude, why not expand that to go, there's probably opposite attitude of that as well that can be rounded out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good theory. I think that there are other systems that have some theories around why that sixth function is important. It's
Sure.
just, it's almost like maybe this is an introverted thinking or accuracy thing. In fact, I know it is, which is that until it clicks for me, until I've got the model really sort of strongly clicked in, I hesitate to lean into other people's explanations. And at the same time, I think you're onto something actually about that. I think there is something to be said for rounding out that function that you're developing with your auxiliary and then mastering both sides of its attitudinal expression. And I've had the darndest time making peace with extroverted thinking or effectiveness. And I've gotten to a place where I recognize that I just got to do things regardless of how I feel, right? I've just got to get them done. I have to create things that are more accessible to others. I can't just be in my little introverted thinking sort of masturbatory cluster.
Your biggest complaint is this is just an arbitrary deadline. You just pick this on the calendar. You extroverted thinking people.
Yeah.
This means nothing. This doesn't make sense. It's like, but we have to pick something, Antonia.
Yeah, it's meaningless, right? It's stupid. I shouldn't have to care.
Like, reschedule it if you don't like it, but you got to put something on the calendar.
Yeah, why? Why are you trapping me to time? I don't understand. So, yeah, I've had a very difficult time making peace with this function. And all of you using extroverted thinking are using it wrong, right? It should be introverted thinking. And at the same time, I also recognize that the platform that I have here to be able to teach and use my introverted thinking or accuracy is built on extroverted thinking or effectiveness, sweat equity, basically. It's facilitated everything. And so the more I make peace with it, the further along we get. You were talking about how you were using extroverted feeling or harmony at our event. And you had gotten some feedback from somebody who uses that function. And I think your initial reaction was just like, that's stupid. But then the more you thought about it, the more you were like, you know what? Actually, you got a point. And I need to make peace with this aspect of who I am. So again, when you're talking about the shadow functions, you're in a place of criticism because it's all being done wrong. And when you can make peace with those elements, I think that you more and more become a powerhouse in refining everything that's going on in quote unquote in the car. And I know that we're about to land the plane because we just walked through our observation of how those functions show up in what order that they want attention. I didn't say something before, kind of want to tag it now, which is that when you're talking about the inferior or the 3-year-old function, I do hesitate to say it's about developing it. I like the word integrating it more. And just as any child that is getting attention and nourishment and love automatically starts growing, right? Just through that attention and nourishment, it starts to grow and become a healthier version, and it grows stronger and it gets taller and it develops in a better way. I think our inferior does that as well. We don't necessarily have to focus on it to grow it, but when we give it attention and nourishment and make it, sort of a part of that dynamic within our function stack, it automatically starts growing because it's getting the attention and nourishment that it needs. Okay, that was the thing I didn't say before when you were talking about it, but I want to make sure to slip it in before we wrap up this podcast.
So what's coming up for you? You've been listening to this podcast. You are the third person here, but you don't have a microphone. We want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below the show. You can leave your comments, ask your questions, or share your story, your personal story of maybe the development that you've gone through, the personal growth journey that you've gone through. One thing I want to caution you is that you don't get distracted by getting all the nuance and learning the system to such a degree that you have the system mastered and you're not applying it to your own life. I remember being in seminary a long time ago, training to go into full-time ministry. And I remember there was kind of a difference between the students who were looking to learn about our faith background that wanted to apply it and actually be in ministry, to other students who just wanted to learn more about the systems and the nuances and all the arguments and win arguments and understand more about what's going on, and didn't really have much of a practical nature to wanting to learn that. They just wanted to learn it to have almost like an ego boost for themselves. So be careful, because there's an opportunity here for you to be distracted away from what we're actually trying to do, at least from our perspective here at Personality Hacker, which is the personal growth aspect of these models and systems. So what's coming up for you? Come over to personalityhacker.com, leave your story, ask your question, or share your feedback.
And if you enjoyed this podcast with me just channeling and Joel just letting me, by the way, thank you. I appreciate you letting me just do that.
Yeah.
I think I just had an idea of something I wanted to talk about, and you sat me in front of a microphone and I just went, and I appreciate that you let me do like 90% of the talking on this particular podcast. I appreciate it. I very much appreciate it. And if you enjoyed this podcast where I did 90% of the talking, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and review of us on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. And if you want to go buy a copy of our book, we highly recommend it. It's called Personality Hacker. It's a good read. It's a 450-page book. It's big. It's chunky. It's got a lot of great content in it, or at least I think it's got a lot of great content in it. spent over a year writing it. It better have good content in it. So go pick yourself up a copy. And if you enjoy it, you can leave us a rating and review on Amazon or Goodreads. That also helps us out a lot.
It would also make a great gift for a birthday, for a holiday. It's a great thing to give to somebody for their personal growth journey, because in the book, we don't just talk about the system. We walk through the process of discovering your personality type. And then there's journal prompts and an aspect of growth built into the book. So you go through and you answer questions after you determine your personality type, your best fit type. You go through the journal prompts and you actually are on a growth path of growing your Copilot. That's where we start. We also show you areas to grow your tertiary 10-year-old and your inferior 3-year-old. There's all sorts of growth opportunities from this book. And it's a great access point for people that are new to the system. So it makes a great gift. Birthday, holiday, whatever you might want to give it to somebody or multiple people in your life. We definitely recommend it. Of course, we wrote it, so we're going to recommend it. I think it's really good.
I concur.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker Podcast.